So my name is Christian, and I'm something of a botanist myself. I love plants and I love collecting them. I think today we're going to be looking at why that's important and some of the reasons why you should collect plants. And we're going to start off by looking at a nice fen in northern Oakland County. So I'm sure most of us are aware, but plant pressing is the action of preserving a plant for either scientific documentation or otherwise by applying pressure over time. Um, and so that's what a plant press looks like up at the top, if you've never seen one before. And then that stack of books over on the left could also be a plant press if you don't have one. So, and then the nice pressed plant specimens look like that, and that's a big leaf aster. So. And then these pressed specimens are stored in an herbarium. So, so what is an herbarium? It's basically a glorified filing cabinet, but there's nothing wrong with that. So it's a place where we store plant specimens, they're cataloged and managed. And these places are generally associated with universities or other large organizations, although there are private herbaria as well. And the plural, it would be herbaria. Um, and that's a picture of the Michigan State Herbarium right there. So I've spent a lot of time down there looking at plant specimens, um, and it's a pretty nice place. So I figured we start with a little bit of the history of herbaria and where it got its start. Probably got its start in northern Italy around the early to mid 1500s with a man named Luca Gini, and he was a physician and a botanist. And at the time, plants and medicine were interlinked, and they probably always have been because people interact with plants mostly out of necessity, or at least they had for thousands of years. Um, and so his pressed specimens, which he called Hortus Siccus, or the dry garden, were used to teach students during the winter months about medicinal plant ID and features of medicinal plants. And there's the only known painting, I think, of Luca, and it's notable that he's got his plant book. It's very admirable of him. So around the same time in Japan, you have the art of Oshibana that's arising, which just means pressed flowers. Uh, and I think this is an important example of how plant pressing can be either scientific or for more cultural and aesthetic reasons. So I've provided an example Oshibana on the right, and it looks like there's a little cat that someone's made. So that's nice. And then into the 19th and 20th centuries, plant collections for scientific documentation really began to take off. So I think most people know about Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery expedition. One of the plants that Lewis collected, uh, his specimen reads, an evergreen plant which grows usually in the open plains. The natives smoke its leaves mixed with tobacco, called by the French sacrecome. And that plant is actually bearberry. So many of you might be familiar with that if you've ever spent time on the Great Lakes dunes. And then another famed exploration is Dr. Alzada Clover and Lois Jotter's expedition through the Colorado River corridor. And they're noted to be the first non-indigenous women to make that journey. And they're honestly worth, looking into and would be a great presentation in its own right. So there's a picture of Dr. Clover there in one of her boats. So why go through all the trouble to even press plants? Because it's not the easiest thing to do. There's lots of steps, but there's also lots of reasons. So one of the main reasons you'd press plants is to document novel occurrences, and which would help us better understand changing plant distributions. We're in a time of rapid change and deterioration of our natural areas, whether that be like parcelization and human disturbance or climate change or other factors. And this has allowed for uh, introduction of near natives and non-native plants into our natural areas. And so collecting today provides context for botanists of tomorrow. And this plant that I've have as an example here is seaside goldenrod. And while not native to Michigan, it is native to the Northeast, and it has expanded its range into the state within the last 20 years due to like salting on the highways. But collections help us to understand this through time and how that looks. And then here's another historical example. This is maybe a favorite plant of many people in here, purple coneflower. It was collected first in the early 1800s at a couple of prairies in Kalamazoo County and St. Joseph County, but it wasn't collected again 30 years until 30 years later in a field in Ann Arbor. And all future collections of this plant are from fields and even more recently roadsides. And so through collecting, you can tell where this plant was actually native to. And in Michigan, that was only a handful of areas. So purple coneflower is definitely a plant that's expanded its range in Michigan, and collections have helped to kind of parse that apart and provide context on what is the true range of this plant pre-European colonization. Another reason you might press plants is to document local extinctions. So this plant, this is a Solidago bicolor or silverrod, historically occurred throughout the Lower Peninsula, but is now mostly or possibly even entirely absent from the state. And I went and looked to see when the last time this plant was collected in Michigan. I think it was like the 70s or the 80s. So that just tells you that if no one's collecting it, it probably isn't a very common plant anymore. And past collections showed that it was more frequent, although it was probably always rare in Michigan. And then maybe most obviously to describe new species. And specimen collections are really the basis of dichotomous key creation. And they're known as like the holotype or the type specimens, which a reference is picked that which the species is defined from. And that really can only happen if you have a physical specimen. So here's another historical example. This goldenrod was collected in 1992 as Houghton's goldenrod. But I like to think that the person who collected it thought it was in a strange area, being, inland away from the Great Lakes coastline and at the border of like Kalkaska and Crawford County. And it was redetermined in 2022 to actually be a different species, and that was Voss's goldenrod, which was recently separated out from Houghton's goldenrod. But that context is lost unless you have a physical collection. And I think a lot of the times people collect things because, oh, that looks strange, or that doesn't seem just right. And a lot of those moments are moments of discovery. So I'm telling myself that's what happened here to make the story a little more interesting. And another reason is to provide basis for all types of research that can use physical specimens. Um, Biodiversity changes over time, looking at associates lists and just the total herbarium collections and seeing which plants were collected 100 years ago versus now. Also, looking at plant interactions with microorganisms. So you can actually see insect damage on herbarium specimens, and there might even be evidence of other types of microorganisms, which many papers have used to do studies on. And then obviously taxonomic research as well. And then this the Beber paper says that um, of the estimated 70,000 plant species still to be described, more than half have already been collected and are stored in herbaria. And I think that's very notable, and it's a good reason to collect plants, is there might be things hiding in plain sight that with more information or better research methods can be parsed out at a later date. And so this plant right here is a Solidago simplex, which recently in Michigan has been separated out into a few different Solidago species. This would be Ontario goldenrod now, Solidago ontarioensis, I believe. So very important things to do. And then one of the reasons I go to the herbaria is to look at similar but difficult taxons side by side. So these are a few members of a sedge group, the Laxiflory group. and they're very challenging. A lot of the sedges are very challenging. So having physical specimens is wonderful because you can lay them out side by side and take a look at their characteristics and work through the key and, and try to get an idea of what these plants are and how they're described in the key, which might not always be obvious just by reading it and looking at pictures. So one of my favorite pastimes, looking at sedges.
Yeah,
And then
we got a couple
oh,
hearts to that one.
couple,
So
yeah, sedges are hard, so it's a good way to learn them. Or any other plant for that matter. And then there's a multitude of other reasons that you might press plants to confirm identification at a later time. I know I've stuck something in a bag and said, oh, well, I'm going to look at that later, even if that's many, many weeks later. Possibly as an additional and quantifiable deliverable for projects, especially for like research projects. It could be great to say, we're going to collect 50 plant specimens from the preserve as an additional deliverable. That might have limited scope for your projects, but it could be something you can add on. And then I'll say for cultural reasons first, and I'm not even entirely sure, like myself, what that might be. Maybe it's creating, art or not sure. That's very specific to the individual. And then for fun, because collecting plants is fun, engaging with them is fun. But my note there is to only do that when it's appropriate. And later we'll go through some of the specific considerations you'll want to take when asking yourself if it's okay to collect plants. And then I've included a sedge that I like. This is beauty sedge or Carex consona. And there's the range map there. Oh, another reason to press plants is to help expand the University of Michigan range map if you deposit at the University of Michigan Herbarium. So you might get a county record that for personal glory even. So and then I went ahead and added this slide in. If you'd like to look at specimens, but you don't have an opportunity to visit an herbarium, you can visit the Consortium of Midwest Herbaria website, and you'll want to travel over to the specimen search page. And then from there, you'll be able to filter by taxon, by the last name of the collector, by the time period, and you can look at any of the specimens that are at a very long list of college herbariums in the Midwest. And then other regions of the United States, I believe, have their own herbaria consortium. So, and then look, you get a plant of the day as well. So that's nice and fun. So now we're going to discuss how to press plants and the process of professionally collecting. So if you're going to be pressing plants and the end goal for your specimens is that they're going to end up at the herbarium, the first thing you're going to want to do is collect the plants. And sometimes that just looks like sticking them in a plastic bag. And honestly, that's what I would recommend is have a plastic bag, a nice big one, and you leave a little air in it so your specimens don't get smushed. And then as you're collecting, you'll want to include recording impertinent associating information into your collection notebook, which we'll cover here on the next slide. And then once you've done that, you want to go home and press your plants, preferably with a plant press. Um, but you can also use textbooks. We'll look at the textbook method later. And then once you've done that, you'll want to deposit it to an accredited herbarium with the herbarium label attached. Usually that's in a spreadsheet, but that might change depending on the herbarium you're depositing to. So, okay. So the collection notebook. This is pretty important that you keep an organized collection notebook, and it's going to just be a list of your specimen collections, and each entry is going to have the associated information with it. So I've created a little collections notebook here, a fake one, with someone with the last name Smith. And so Smith's first plant was common blue violet. So you record the Latin name or the common name, and you want to make sure you record the coordinate point. Usually I just open up Google Maps and take the coordinate point from there. But if you have like an Avenza or a field maps, that might be more accurate. You're going to want to put the date that it was collected. and then also the habitat. So we see that this violet was growing in an open lawn at the locality, which is Dexter Huron Metro Park. And it's important to include an associates list too. Pick a few of the dominant plants that are occurring with this plant, and maybe even some of the more notable plants that are occurring. And then you'll want to include the abundance of the plant as well. So common, frequent, infrequent, uncommon, rare, just with the note that maybe you shouldn't be collecting things that are locally uncommon. And then as you collect additional plants, you just sequentially go up the list and making sure you're putting all that information in. And I want to make a note here that say that uh, Smith deposits their first specimen at the University of Michigan Herbarium. If they decide to deposit their second specimen at the Michigan State Herbarium, you don't change the order of the numbering. So this order is constant whether you deposit specimen 3 at Herbarium 1 or Herbarium 2. So hopefully I explained that without being too confusing. You just don't change your numbering depending on where you're depositing. It stays the same. And then I like to use little Write in the Rain notebooks because they're waterproof, so they can take some abuse. Although this is not a plug for Write in the Rain. Okay, and then once you've taken all this information in your notebook, you can do the fun task of creating an herbarium label. And this is probably the most important part to get right when you're collecting and pressing plants. So, and each herbarium is going to be a little bit different on how they want you to set this up. I know for Michigan State, they have you fill out a spreadsheet, which will, when they print it, it kind of prints this out how they want it. So maybe just reach out to the herbarium ahead of time and ask what their process is. And so the herbarium label looks like this. It might look a little different here and there, like I said, but it's going to have the Latin binomial and the authority of the plant. For this plant, it's Linnaeus. That you're going to have the family of the plant and then those coordinates that you wrote down. The county is good to include, and then the locality as well. So for this plant, I said that it was on state land. I gave the site specific to our project that it was located on, and I added a way for people to find it if they didn't have coordinates or a GPS. So it was 4/5 of a mile east on Murray Lake Road from the intersection of this road and County Road 421. You want to include a brief habitat description. I just said mature northern hardwoods. Maybe you should use the MNFI natural communities if you can. And I said it was a single tree selection harvest. And then a lot of people don't include an associates list, but I think the associates list is very important. As we talked about, it can be used in research. It can be used for future botanists to know the diversity of an area compared to, if they go and visit it today. So it's really important that you include, maybe 5 to 10 associates. I like to include more than less. And then you're going to include your name and then the collection number from that sequential list that we talked about, and then the collection date as well. And then I didn't include it here, but sometimes a note about more ephemeral characteristics is useful. So this plant in particular, northern wood sorrel, the petals tend to like fall off when you press it and it goes through the drying oven at the herbarium. So it might have been good if this one didn't have a flower on it, but include the color of the petals, maybe the number of petals, stuff that is not going to last 50 years, or stuff that doesn't last through the drying process, like colors generally. And then some herbariums are offering now the ability to like link an iNaturalist observation. So maybe you take an iNaturalist observation with each specimen, and it's just an additional piece of information. So there's a QR code there. But very important that you get the herbarium label wrong. I can't stress that enough. So some important tips when it comes to collecting plants is to keep an organized collection notebook and then write your entries as you collect them. So, as you pluck plants and put them in a plastic bag, or maybe you have a fancy vasculum, you're going to want to make sure that you're writing that down in the notebook, writing the coordinate point, writing the associates as you go. You're not going to remember at the end of the day after you go home where you collected all these plants. And that's not a challenge in any way to try that, because you will forget. Um, and then if you have multiple collections of the same plant, you're going to want to make sure that those go into separate receptacles. Say you collected two striped maples from the same day but different locations. If you just chuck that in your plastic bag, you're not going to remember which one came from where. So it's keep those separated as well. And in general, just stay organized because that tends to be the death of any good project. So try to stay on top of that. And that's kind of a learning process. And then collect the entire specimen if you can. One of the reasons we collect plants is to show their true form and what they look like. So if that means digging for a rhizome, you're going to have to dig for a rhizome. And this plant here has a very notable root structure. This is Baltic rush, Juncus balticus, and it's actually a distinguishing feature of the plant. Had you just collected the stalks, those little shoots, it would have been more difficult to ID. So, and it might make it tough to put on an herbarium, piece of paper, but it's worth the challenge, I promise. And then maybe you're not interested in collecting plants and depositing them at the herbarium because it is a lot of work. But you might want to press plants for other reasons. And this is a much less involved process overall. So you collect the plants. The process is really the same. You collect the plants, and you really it may or may not include any information. I know when I'm collecting just to make art, I don't actually really write down any information. It just goes in the bag and it goes in between a book and then it gets forgotten about. There's nothing wrong with that. And then you're going to want to press the plants, usually with a textbook if you're just doing it for fun and not depositing to an herbarium. And then it's optional. You can frame them. You can use them for, personal research or, looking at identifying features, going through the keys. You could use them for a lot of the same reasons you'd use other plant specimens. But, they lose that value of being cataloged in an herbarium. This is just mostly for fun. So, and there's a picture of a couple plant specimens that I pressed this year. There's zigzag goldenrod over there on the right, and then a smattering of plants on the left. So we talked about using a plant press, but plant presses are expensive. They're about $100. There's different models you can get, but they're all about $100 or so. And so if you're going to use textbooks, which I think many of us have lying around, you're going to want to obtain many large textbooks. This can be easily done by attending an institution with a 4-year degree. You might have a lot left over after that, such as a college physics textbook. And then you're going to want to layer pieces of printer paper, your specimens, and then, a couple more pieces of printer paper. And I found that printer paper works the best because if you use something like paper towel or something with an imprinted pattern, that's going to be translated onto your specimen, especially if it's something with broad leaves that would pick up a pattern like that. It might not matter as much for sedges, but printer paper hasn't failed me yet. And then you're going to want to stack additional books on top or wait, whatever that looks like, and then wait like a week and a half or 2 weeks before removing. And then sometimes, at the 1 week mark, if you're collecting in the early spring, plants tend to be wetter than they are later in the season. And if it's not going to be deposited in an herbarium, it's not going to be going through a drying oven. So I personally have never run into issues with my specimens molding, but that can be a problem I hear if you collect in the early spring and you tend to collect like fleshier and larger plant specimens. Never had that problem with the sedge or, smaller spring ephemeral plants, but maybe if you collected like a mayapple or something, you might have problems with mold. So just consider that. Um, and then yeah, wait 2 weeks. Check on your specimens maybe once in between and put new pieces of printer paper in if you notice they're a little wet. And then usually after that, they're ready to be framed and stored. Um, and another note, maybe just on sedges, is the earlier you collect sedges, the better. The later you collect them, while the perigynia might be more developed, they tend to disintegrate as soon as the specimen comes out of the drying process. So in the herbarium, it's less of a problem because there's fragment packets that they use to collect pieces of the specimens that are, fall off the page. But in your own personal collections, it might just be added mess. So it's something to consider. And that's what the process looks like there over on the right. Very simple, very straightforward, and it puts those textbooks to good use. So let's talk about some of the considerations that you should be taking when you're collecting and the best practices. So plant collecting is really fun, but we need to be aware that, natural systems and our natural areas are already under threat from, um, maybe plant poaching or, just various things that disturb it. So do I need permission to be collecting where I am? If you're on private land, you need to have the permission of the landowner. If that's like an M&A preserve or a TNC preserve, maybe reach out to the local coordinator for the organization and ask for permission and kind of explain that you're just looking to collect plants. Um, Usually they're pretty willing to, give you an opportunity to do that. If you're on state or federal land, you're going to need a permit, which we'll look at very briefly later. So that's something to be aware about. And then if you're collecting on client property, you might want to check if you have client permission to be collecting plants, especially if you're going to be depositing them at the herbarium. So maybe best to ask a project manager, or if you're in a position to ask the client directly, to check that before you start collecting and depositing specimens. Although I'm not sure if anyone's ever gotten in trouble for it. Just saying. And then, should I be collecting? Is the plant rare? Is it locally uncommon? Um, maybe you shouldn't be collecting if there's not a lot of something in an area. It just wouldn't be responsible. And then, as we discussed, do I need a permit? If you're collecting a threatened or endangered species, you definitely need a permit, and you need to check if it's state threatened, state endangered, or federally threatened or endangered. And then if you're on federal or state land, like a state forest or a national forest, um, you're supposed to get a permit to collect. And especially if you're going to be depositing it at an herbarium, it becomes a piece of history. And so it's good to be able to check all your boxes off and say that you had those permits. Um, and then do I know what I'm collecting? And then, the answer there is not always, because sometimes I collect a plant because I don't know what it is and I want to figure out what it is. But I will say, please be careful, because if you stumbled across this beautiful little iris here and you saw that there was a lot of it where you were standing and kind of is growing like a weed, actually, and you thought it looked nice on a piece of paper, you'd actually be committing a crime, because that's our federally threatened dwarf lake iris. So it's very important to be aware of what you're collecting, and to just be mindful of how much of it there is. Try to know a little bit about the plant or where you're going to be to know if there's listed species. Um, yeah, so I'll always be considering these things. Okay, the less than fun slide. So I will preface this by saying that I have never had to personally apply for any of these permits. They've usually been done under, like the project, someone who's above me does it. And I also tend not to collect off state and federal land just because it's a little more complicated if you want to, do it the right way. So if you're going to be on state land, from what I can garner, you're going to need a non-event land use permit, which is what this looks like on the right over here. And it's not specific to collecting plants, but I believe they're, for maybe lower intensity use activities. So page one looks like this. You know, uh, Under the project purpose and associated activities, you would just put the plants that you're looking to collect. It'd probably be better if you were specific about it. And then also later on in this permit, they ask that you include the specific compartments that you'll be in, and maps. They have you go pretty in depth about why you're collecting. So hopefully you have a good reason. If you're on federal land, From what I can, garner off the Forest Service website for botanical collection and bioprospecting, a free use forest products free use permit is appropriate, which is the FS 2408 permit. I couldn't find a link online, but it's supposed to exist in like the regional, Forest Service offices. So not very promising if you wanted one. It seems kind of difficult, but again, sometimes it's just easier to collect off private land or, um, like a Michigan Nature Association land if you have permission. So yeah, those are the permits. Maybe other people know a little bit more about it than I do, but this is what I could find online. So I'd like to talk about how some things are just difficult to collect, kind of by the nature of what they are. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try your best to collect them if it isn't too much of a hassle. So things like acorns or other like hard fruits, so hickory nuts, um, you can't press that on a piece of paper. That's just not how physics works. So a lot of herbariums use little cardboard boxes, and then some of them like bag them up in plastic bags as well. And I guess we'll talk about poisonous plants here, for the obvious reasons. Like, poison ivy, poison sumac can be challenging plants to collect. Even plants like stinging nettle, I can imagine would be rather difficult. I've never collected any of these plants for those reasons, but um, people do collect them, and they're stored actually with warnings in the herbarium that they contain toxic compounds that will cause skin irritation. So there's Western poison ivy over there in all its glory. And then conifers and evergreen plants are challenging to collect and have them stay looking good. So you wouldn't know it if you were just looking at them, but that's hemlock over on the left, and that is looks like we got black spruce on the right. Not that there isn't important information here to learn about ID characteristics. It's just you lose the needles. Um, and then usually those needles are put in those little white rectangles down by the specimen label. Those are called the fragment packets. And I didn't touch on it earlier, but when you deposit a specimen to the herbarium, they go into a freezer for about 2 weeks, uh, and that kills any of the bugs in there and helps to reduce the level of pests in an herbarium. And then after that, they go into a drying oven. So usually the drying process is what knocks a lot of the needles off of the conifers and other evergreen plants. We looked at that bearberry earlier, and even though it was 200 years old, it wasn't in great shape. So I always think it's silly looking at evergreen specimens sometimes. And then, many of you might be wondering, why can't I just use iNaturalist? And that's a pretty valid question, because it's a great tool and it has a lot of application for research, but it has less application than physical specimens do. You can't do taxonomic research to the same degree as you can with a physical specimen. You can't do any genetics with iNaturalist. You can't do physical measurements with iNaturalist. Um, there's more bias with iNaturalist observations, even if they're research grade, and that just comes with how many observers there are. And sometimes the location data is off on observations, and that's not caught. And it's also more difficult to be confirmatory for difficult species. Some species are really hard to ID from pictures. Not that there aren't people who can do it, but having a physical specimen is the best way of doing that. And then I have a question of the longevity of iNaturalist and other, similar uh, groupings of scientific community data. Is where are they going to be in 200 years? Who's going to own them? And what is it going to look like? This bitternut hickory was collected over 200 years ago, and it still looks great. And it's still around, and it's still able to be used for research. And maybe I guess it's not fair because iNaturalist hasn't been around for 200 years, but I have my doubts, is all I'm saying. And Herbaria seem to be more of a non-shifting entity in the winds of time, we'll say. So Thank you for taking the time to listen and to learn about plants and plant specimens. Um, plant collecting is exceptionally important, especially in this day and age where we're losing a lot of natural systems. We're losing the integrity that they had and the biodiversity that they had. And future botanists, they're going to want context on the rate of that change and what has been lost. And I like to think of herbarium specimens as like planting a tree. You don't always get to enjoy the tree in your lifetime, but you plant it in hope that, down the line, someone else will be able to take away something from it. And I really believe that's what herbarium specimens are. They're an opportunity to contribute to something that's much larger than any of us, and for something that's exceptionally important, especially in the rapidly changing times that we're living in. So. And I think that's all I've got, and I'd be happy to take any specific questions if there are any.
Yeah,
Um,
we do have a couple. Thank you so much. This was
yeah,
really a nice presentation, like an introductory, but also nice background history on Herbaria. So, I guess let's get to the questions. We have one that said, should record the landform and soil type. This is a comment from Robert Aote. So I believe he's with Michigan Botanical Society.
right. I would say definitely, Robert, if you know the landform and you're able to do like texture by feel, that would be excellent information to include in an herbarium label. You don't want to go writing any novels, in your herbarium label, but you want to make sure you have enough information. Yes, I think that'd be an excellent piece of data to add if you have it, or if it's pertinent to your study.
Yeah, I can't say I've seen too many of landforms. Sometimes I think in some of the older herbarium sheets, but I think it
Right.
is good if you are out there and able to collect it, you know. So, yeah, there's quite a bit more
Okay.
questions that came, so let's keep going. What if you don't know the species of the plant? What should you put in the notebook if you're not strong on plant identifications skills? Can you still submit to Herbaria?
I'll say you can definitely submit to Herbaria if your plant skills aren't super strong. And honestly, I think that'd be a great idea. It'd be a great way to learn. And if you don't know what something is when you're collecting it, maybe you can get like if you know the family, if it's possible, you just know the family or the genus, try to include that. Um, Maybe you can use like Seek or iNaturalist to get you close and write down what it thinks the plant is, and then at a later time go back to your specimen once it's been cataloged and redetermine that in Herbarium, or someone else can do it for you. So that's the beauty of Herbaria is you have people who go through collections and check to make sure that everything is correct. So so yeah,
Okay,
that's a great question.
great. Yep. Thanks for the follow-up on that. The next question says, if half the 70,000 plants stored in Herbaria are not described, are those 35,000 plants just called unknown?
No, they're usually listed under other species. Like the Voss's goldenrod was originally labeled as a Houghton's goldenrod, and so it had sat in herbaria for 30 years before someone said, "Hey, that's actually something else." And by that time, Voss's goldenrod had already been described. But for example, there might be species that are included under one taxon that are actually another one, and we just don't know yet. So they're usually underneath another name, which is part of the excitement, I think.
Yeah, cool. So here there's more questions.
Sure.
Many smaller Barria are unfortunately at risk from waning institutional support. Oh, that's just like a comment. So,
Well, it's not even the smaller herbarium; it's some of the larger ones too, unfortunately. I want to say it was Duke's herbarium that's shutting down, and they're looking for other herbaria to take on the collection. So, public support for herbaria needs to be increasing, and getting people excited in plant pressing is hopefully the start of that. So,
right. Let's see. There's another one. Um, do you have any insight as to what types of specimens an herbarium might accept? Some Are some types of plants overcollected, such as very common plants?
Um, I that's a great question. Herbaria will accept all plant specimens that you give them, provided your notes are accurate and your organization's good. I don't think they'll ever turn away a specimen because they have too many of them. But if you've collected 50 common blue violets, they might ask you to start diversifying a little bit. Unless you have a project that, and a lot of times you might have a project that looks at a specific species. So there's nothing wrong with collecting a lot of one thing or adding to a large collection of something else. And I will say, maybe the common plants tend to be over collected, but also the particularly pretty plants tend to be over collected because people like to see them on a piece of paper. Um, and so maybe that's a good point to say if you think there's stuff out there that isn't as visually, appealing or is not a charismatic plant, maybe it's worth collecting just for that matter alone.
That's a good point. Are there any tips on preserving color in pressed plants? I'm assuming maybe the petals they're talking about, or
Yeah, which those, that tends to be something that fades rather quickly with time. Keeping plants away from the sunlight. That's why these are in large filing cabinets at Herbaria. Because sunlight will fade the colors of specimens and make them age quicker. But a lot of that color loss is immediate after the drying process, and time only has so much of an effect on it from there out. So, and I don't think there's anything you can do to stop that. That's kind of just a trade-off, I think.
hmm um, let's see, there's a couple more. Let's keep coming in.
Yep.
One is from Michigan University. It says, could I use physical plant tissue from herbaria to sequence DNA? And I think that is true. Yes.
Yeah, I believe that is a yes, although I'm assuming with the age of the specimen becomes less, application for how much DNA you can get, how
Depends on
complete the
the size,
genome
I
is.
think, of the plant material too, I think.
Right, right. Um, yeah, if you just have a tiny specimen and not a lot to pull off of it, you just, you're basically using the whole thing to get that data, and it might not be worth it at that point. But the answer is yes. I do believe that is a research application. But I think fresh specimens are always preferred when it comes to like
Sure.
genomic sequencing.
Okay, there's a couple more, and then I think we should be wrapping up shortly. So,
Okay.
when doing a flora of a preserve and on a practical level, what and how many species should we collect?
I would say there is no number of species you should collect. You should focus on collecting species that are locally uncommon, or may represent, like they may be associates of other species, of importance. And that takes a lot of like, personal experience. Um, and I would say when you collect those handful of specimens, make sure their associates lists are long because the associates list can give a lot of information. If you have 10 or 15 plants that it associates with in that location, it's like collecting many specimens. You have a lot more information than just what one specimen can give you. So I don't think there's any right number to collect, but maybe focus on collecting whatever to the project might be, considered important, whether that be, yeah, like locally uncommon species or species that define natural communities, those sorts of things.
Okay, there's two more. One is, will the herbarium acknowledge your submission? I'm not sure.
You mean like letting you know? Maybe they mean like letting you know when they get your specimen.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, typically, don't you have to go and bring it in
yeah, you
personally?
physically drop
Yeah.
them off. Usually, yeah, I would contact the herbarium ahead of time because they're generally not
Mhm.
just like open to the public. Usually there's like tours or email the person who runs it, the collections coordinator. But
But I don't think if they post it on, like, let's say for Michigan Flora, I have
yeah,
submitted some plans that I have not gotten authorization or, written that they have it posted or
and
whatever.
I don't think they will,
Yeah.
which is it takes a long time from the point of collection to the point of being cataloged and uploaded into, all the places it's going to end up going. So maybe just be patient, and if you have like specific questions about your collections, like reach out to the herbarium and ask them specifically. But they're not going to go sending emails about when specimens have been uploaded or anything like that. So.
Okay, and last but not least, this is from Jenna. She says, "Hi Christian, thanks for the field collection photos, and then any other tips for keeping these organized in the field? Was that a modified piece of PVC pipe?"
Oh, if you're talking about the vasculum, that's actually like it was a Forest Service like plant collection like metal cylinder that they issued to botanists. My friend Joe has two of them, so when we went on that trip together, we just used those instead of plastic bags. Was there another part to that question? I'm blanking. The
Yeah, it
first
just
half.
says, any other tips for keeping things
Oh.
organized in the field?
Really just writing them down as you collect. And also, it helps to collect many things from one coordinate point. I'll try to find a coordinate point that has like three or four things that I want to collect. And then your associates list and your, habitat description can be copied for those like four specimens. So that can help stay organized just because you have less data that you have to take. And then yeah, writing them down as they come. Um, you're not going to remember, the next day, the next couple days, like, oh, I collected that from this exact spot, So that those are my big tips right there.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Definitely, I would stress the importance of kind of writing down the associated plants. That's just something that I like to do, just so that, if you do want to bring in the plant later to an herbarium, you can have a little bit more context, especially if you're maybe not 100% certain of what that species is, just for ID purposes too. Describing where you are, the landform, the plants associated in the area, and just kind of keeping us, per specimen collected, good detailed notes. So, but yeah, thank you so much, Christian. This was really nice, kind of a low stakes but yet informative presentation, and it really kind of, at least it gets me excited for plant collection in the spring, hopefully. So,
Yeah.
thank you, everybody. Anything else you can think of? All right. Well, I will log out. Thank you guys, and we'll be talking. Thanks so much, Christian. Have a good one.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.